if there are questions that you may have missed out during the session, I will be always glad to answer them after the session whenever you want to ask them. So I will be sharing my email ID and contact details with you. You are free to reach out to me whenever you want. Fine. So now let's first understand the overall structure of CAT, especially as it has evolved over the last 3 years, and why this becomes especially important with respect to our preparation plan. So if I consider these last 3 years, 2019 and the years before that, that is 17, 18, etc., was one set of patterns. 2020 was one set of pattern due to the COVID first wave. And then 2021, the pattern came by based on the feedback of what happened in 2020. So if I look at my CAT test, it basically has three sections here. VARC, which is a combination of anywhere close to 8 to 10 pure verbal ability questions and anywhere close to 16 to 20 or even 24 RC questions, followed by DILR, which are purely sets, followed by the quant section. Now, one of the key aspects of the CAT test is that, like NMAT, and in fact, these are the only two tests which have sectional timing. What do I mean by sectional timings is that earlier, when in the 2019 pattern, when this was a 3-hour paper, all of these used to be 1-hour sections, and they used to appear in the same order as I have written, which means that you needed to start your test with the VRC section, move on to DILR, and then go on to quant. You could not actually change that based on your convenience or your strengths and weaknesses. This aspect of CAT still remains constant. You cannot change the order of the sections. However, since 2020 and in 2021 as well, we have a drastic change where this 1 hour has now gone out of the window, and now you have 40 minutes per section, which has its own advantages as well as its own disadvantages in terms of tackling the section. What are those disadvantages? We will see that later. Now, what was the biggest difference that was caused by this? Till 2019, CAT was a 100-question test with a breakup which went something like this: 34, 32, and 34 questions. Now in 20, when we moved to a 2-hour test, nobody really knew what is the number of questions that you will have in the exam. And there, obviously, we all had to experiment with a number of various patterns in terms of number of questions. What we saw here was that we ended up having 26, 24, and 26 questions, thereby giving me a total of 76 questions. Now, as part of this entire exercise of conducting the test over 2 hours, a lot of students came back and complained to the CAT authorities that, hey, your time has reduced by 1/3 from 3 hours to 2 hours, but your number of questions has gone down by only 25%, which is becoming unfair for us. The test becomes too tough. And that is where CAT last year moved to a newer model where we had 24 questions in verbal, 20 in DILR, and 22 in quant. So the test moved to a 66 question model. Now, why is this entire data important for us? If this year the test decides to stick to a 2-hour model, where the CAT authorities are able to conduct 3 slots per day, which in fact is better for them in terms of distributing students, then this becomes your most likely breakup of questions per section. And all your preparation will start going in this direction. At the same time, we need to be mentally prepared that if CAT reverts back to the old 3-hour format, then we need to be prepared for 34, 32, 34 once again. That is a 100-question pattern once again, which brings with it its own set of challenges. Now, why am I saying that there is a possibility that we could go to a 3 hour pattern? The reason for that is one of the key exams at the undergraduate level, that is the BBA IPM Indore exam, has again gone back to its old format where it used to be a longer test. Since the last 2 years, it was a shorter test. Now, because this is the flagship exam for IIM Indore, and one of the IIMs there at the undergrad level has taken this stand of going back to the old format, there is a remote possibility that CAT also might do the same. If that happens, then our entire preparation will change. So this is an overview of the entire section. Now we move on to each section in terms of how it is structured, what you should expect, and how you start preparing for each of these. So any doubts at this stage for any of you? Fine. So in that case, I will move on to each section now. Yeah, just a second. Okay. Thanks, Ria. So we'll move on to the next part of our discussion. Now, as I said, we start by a section by section analysis. So we start with the one section which a lot of students get intimidated by, and that is VARC, which is the acronym for verbal ability and reading comprehension. So what is, first of all, what is the breakup of the section here in terms of these two aspects? So the way the CAT test is structured is that the first part of the paper comprises reading comprehension. If I go by last year's model, and I will show you all three models, or I will show you the two important models, 3 hour versus 2 hour. But first, starting with the 2 hour 66 question model. Here, when you look at this, what is the structure that you have? Last year, we had 4 RCs, that is 4 passages of 4 questions each, followed by the verbal ability section, which had 8 questions in all, because this is 16 questions. Now, when I look at the remaining 8 questions, a typical breakup, and this is where CAT becomes slightly predictable for the verbal section, is that there are only 3 standard question types here. First being, there are typically 3 parajumbles. Over the last 4 to 5 years, CAT has had a fixed format also for the parajumbles, which I will come to. Then there are 3 para summary questions. And finally, you have 2 odd man out or out of context questions. What are these? This is a question type which is very common only to CAT. So what exactly is this entire structure, and what is the uniqueness of this? So when I look at these 4 RCs of 4 questions each, what are the salient points of these RCs? The first aspect that you need to remember is that these RCs are neither too short, like say a civil services exam, nor too long, like say ZAT or IFT or any of those tests. These typically range between 400 to 650 words. This is the standard limit. Of course, there is no rule for this. This is a typical benchmark that we have observed over the last 5 to 6 years. So this 400 to 650 words is the typical word length. 2 important qualities of the RCs here are that they are readable in nature, in the sense that you will feel as if you are reading a blog or you are reading a magazine article from, say, a National Geographic, etc. At the same time, they are also relatively dense, and I would say packed with information or packed with a lot of ideas. So it is not something that you can read like a story. You cannot say that, okay, I'm reading something that, let's say, a Chetan Bhagat or a Frederick Fawcett has written. No, this is more intense in nature. You need to understand the entire topic and then go on to answer your questions. When I move on to these 4 questions here, we come to the other salient feature of the RCs, which is that the questions are inferential in nature. What do I mean by inferential? I will come to in just a few moments. But broadly speaking, when we talk about questions of RC, I can divide them into two core areas. One is pure data driven or factual questions, where you are actually reading the RC, finding the data points from the RC and answering the question. Whereas the inferential question will make you read two points from various parts of the RC, put them all together and then arrive at your answer. What question types can you expect to see? I will come to right in some time. Okay. What are the kind of subject areas that you need to look at? Again, I will discuss when I go to RCs in slightly more detail. But before that, I would like to go to the VA part, which is para jumbles, para summary, and out of context. Now, for those of you who are taking CAT for the first time, CAT is the only MBA exam among the prominent ones that has a question type called theta or numerical entry questions. So this is similar to what you would have in the GATE exam or some of the other engineering tests, where you have a question and then the answer is to be input in a box. There are no MCQs there. This theta kind of questions are present in all three sections of the CAT test. In VA, the para jumbles are predominantly theta questions, which increases the difficulty level of these. The para summary questions are conventional MCQs with 4 options. The out of context questions are theta questions. Now, what are these 3 question types predominantly? Fine. So para jumbles, there is a fixed format that CAT has been following since the last 4 to 5 years. You have 4 statements which need to be arranged in a specific order. And that order, so let's say my statements are 1, 2, 3, 4. Then the order, which is, let's assume the order is 2, 4, 1, 3. Then this answer 2, 4, 1, 3 needs to be input into the box. Why does it become difficult as a theta question is when you are practicing para jumbles as an MCQ. Let's say I identify that statement 1 and statement 3 go back to back. Statement 1 says that Gaurav was inclined towards playing cricket every day. And then statement 3 says he used to practice for a couple of hours every day. Then you know that statement 3 has to logically follow statement 1. In a typical MCQ, this knowledge that 1 and 3 will go back to back. Yeah. Yes, Sakshi, tell me. Can you type in your query here? So I'll continue till the time you actually put in your query. So as I said, this knowledge that these 2 statements go back to back often helps you eliminate options. And once you have eliminated options, you are in a position to actually arrive at your answer. As if you are able to eliminate those options and arrive at your answer faster. In this particular scenario, you need to be very sure that once you get the 1-3 combination, are the next 2 statements 2 and 4 or 4 and 2? Do you know that? No, at this stage you don't. So that increases your difficulty level, and that is something that you need to understand clearly. So of course, there are techniques to tackle that. How do you do that is something we will see when we solve the mocks. The next question type, very important, para summary. I would say that para summary is a subset of reading comprehension. Why do I say so? Just as you had reading comprehension with anywhere close to 400 to 500 words, your para summary will be one short paragraph, 4 to 5 lines at the most. But then you will need to identify the key ideas within this passage and mark the option that most closely adheres to these key ideas. Now here, One good practice option for this is something that we used to do in school, which used to be called Prezi writing. If you remember what Prezi writing was, there you had a paragraph given to you with a specific word length, let's assume 100 words. You had to express the key ideas of that passage in exactly 1/4 of the original word length, which was 25 words. That same logic applies here. You don't have a word length, but you are using your, you're using the key ideas and putting it in the form of one sentence. There are, of course, a lot of techniques that you can use, like not using examples, not going beyond the scope of the passage, etc., which we shall see in subsequent sessions that we do later. But this, again, a very important question type. The problem with this question type is that here you can lose marks. Why do I say you can lose marks? Because in CAT, each MCQ, while it can give you 3 marks for every correct answer, you lose 1 mark for every incorrect answer. So here, because this is an MCQ, any incorrect answer will cause a loss to your score. Whereas for the TETA questions, you get 3 marks for every correct answer, but you don't lose marks here. So that becomes a slightly risk-free question for you. Coming to the last question type here, out of context questions. Again, here CAT has a standard pattern. You have 5 statements. Just as I said, in parajumbles, you have 4 statements. Here you have 5 statements. Out of these 5, 4 will form a paragraph. And I will dare say that 1 is slightly out of context. That is, it is slightly disconnected. I have seen a lot of actual CAT questions where all 5 sentences have come from the same article, but 4 of them were presented back to back. The 5th one was from another part of the same article. So this overall is the structure of the verbal section. And when you start practicing your mocks, when you start practicing your sections, these are the 4 areas that you will need to practice the most. Now, one of the key questions that I get from a lot of students is, if these are my question types, then in that case, do I need to ignore, or can I afford to ignore grammar, vocabulary, critical reasoning, etc.? My answer to that question would be a big no. You cannot afford to ignore those particular concepts because they are equally important in ensuring that you are able to tackle these particular question types here. Yeah. So before I go into RCs, before I go into question types within RCs, any questions from any of you? Guys, anybody has questions here? Okay, thanks, Praveen. So let's now focus on the exact RCs. As I said, when I consider RCs here, the key idea was short passage, readable, but with inferential questions. So first we need to understand what are the key areas from which RCs can be asked, because that will determine how you need to start practicing. So some of the broad areas which are commonly in vogue over the last 4 to 5 years are: one is science and technology. Now, when I talk about science and technology, some of the key ideas that you shouldn't expect a passage which is very, very technical. Nobody is going to give you a passage on the working of data analytics or the working of robotics. No. So you won't feel like you're reading a class on digital signal processing or something of that sort. No, not at all. What will happen is the topic will have its implications or its effects or its connection. So the topic that will be chosen will have a social angle or an economic angle attached to it. So all of these together, as I said, have some kind of a social connect or an economic connect attached to it with respect to society. So here, the kind of topics on which you should be reading up would be topics like data analytics, machine learning, Internet of Things. Then you have artificial intelligence and its implications on society, industry, business. You have robotics. Along with it, you have areas like data privacy, which is one of the most important topics under consideration globally. Then you have automation, because see, why do I say these are important areas that you need to a nanotechnology for that matter? Why am I talking about all these topics here? Is all of these affect the way we live? So for example, I can have an article which talks about automation affecting the handicrafts industry or automation affecting the workers in a certain district, and how that has led to increasing crime rates in that district. So the passage will never talk about how automation works. It will rather talk about its implications, or it will talk about the need for automation and so on. So there is always a social aspect attached to it. So you have to think not just as a tech person or as a as a specialist of a certain function. You have to think like a social scientist when you are reading that topic. Why am I saying this? Because now onwards, when you read passages for CAT, let's say you are reading any article on, say, nanotechnology. So don't think only about what nanotechnology is. Don't look at only absorbing the data. Try and think about these aspects. Okay, how is it connected to the industries where it is being applied? What are the challenges that you are going to face? Um, a lot of us who are in this industry, or a lot of us who are into CAT prep, often tell our students that a key hallmark of the people who do well in CAT and in the MBA courses is that they are always keen to learn. They are very curious about things. So when you read all these passages, you need to widen your horizons and try and think how it affects the world around me. Do that for all your passages. So this is one area. The second area that is currently amongst, very, very important would be governance. Now, what do I mean by governance here? This is not about this being a civics class. So nobody will really have a passage on how Panchayati Raj works or what are the duties of the President of India. No. But here it will be about practical applications. Later, when I share passages with you, I mean, a few days down the line, when I share passages or when I share links on the Telegram groups, you will see there was this CAT passage that I had in 2019, I believe, which spoke about how the use of metrics, that is quantifiable metrics in education, may not necessarily be a good thing. So it mixed two topics: measuring the output of teachers in government schools and how it affects the productivity of those teachers. So here, in all these kinds of government schemes, Aadhaar, what is called the JAM Trinity, Jandan accounts, microfinance, etc. All these subtopics here, which could be economics, which could be finance, which could again go back into GST, for instance, taxation, which could go into the corporate world. These are all, these are all contemporary issues where the practical applications of all of these issues become very common subject matters for your RCs. The third important area that you need to focus on would be your social sciences. Let me convert it into social sciences rather than history and geography. Now, if I were to tell you some of the most, some of the topics that have come in CAT over the last 2-3 years are topics like, you'll be very surprised. How were maps made in China in the medieval era? Pure history. One was about origin of some, some kind of shells or some kind of animals in, I think it was in Ireland or in Spain. So these are topics which are related to the history, geography, and the climate of those areas, and then go on to give me a theoretical understanding of that particular topic. So this is something which is more of a trivia read, but is very, very readable and very solvable in terms of the overall ideas. Fourth, I would say extremely important because of its global, global relevance would be areas like climate change, or what is also called sustainability, and all areas related to it. So when I say sustainability, it could be about uh, green fuels. It could be about recycling, eliminating global waste, eliminating electronic waste, and so on. So all of these come into play. And then finally, you have topics which are related to philosophy. These generally tend to be the toughest. And here with philosophy, I will also include sociology. So for example, one of the topics in the last 2 years, I think at 2020, was based on British imperialism. One was based on, I think, the growth of music during the times of imperialism. Last year's CAT, one of my topics was based, I think, on philosophy in Europe or something of that sort. And it was literally very tough. So these are overall the key areas where you should be reading a lot more. So a lot of faculty and a lot of experts will tell you that you should read, articles and you should read the editorials every day. Yes, of course, you should read that. But apart from that, there are a lot of other sources that you can focus on, which actually enhance your knowledge and help you prepare better and faster. What are those sources? So one key source is Aeon. A lot of CAT articles come from this particular, or a lot of your CAT passages come from here. So that is something you should be reading very, very regular. Then you have your international magazines, international newspapers, etc. Things like Washington Post, you have your Huffington Post. For topics on climate change, etc., you can have questions. You can read more of National Geographic, Discovery, etc. I will be sharing a list of all the key links from where passages have been asked over the last 3 years in the Telegram groups. And based on that, you can keep reading from there. So this takes one aspect of what are the key areas on which CAT can ask you passages. Now, once you know what kind of passages to expect, we need to see what kind of questions to expect. So before I go there, any questions here, Shweta or anybody else? Okay. So in that case, let me now tell you what are the kind of questions that you are expected to see in your actual, in your actual RC. So first, when I consider the RC here, the common question types that you are likely to see are, you will have the author's opinion. That is, the author will be taking a stand throughout the passage, and your questions could be of the form, which of the following statements or which of the following arguments is the author most likely to agree with. So this same question can be asked in 4 different manners. I can have most likely to agree, least likely to agree, then most likely to disagree, and then least likely to disagree. So all of them basically make you understand what the author's argument is actually all about. You need to understand what is he trying to say and then try and think from his point of view. What is actually the topic where he will say, okay, these are the points I agree with, and mark that as your answer. Here, the key idea is your options are going to be very, very close to each other, and they will change with respect to just a few words here and there. So some option will possibly generalize the author's statement. Some will pick up a very narrow part of what he said and uh, put that as the option. One of the options will generally contradict what the question is asking for, and maybe 1 or 2 options will be very close to each other. So there, with practice, you need to understand that between these two, and it often happens that both the options are, both the options are such that he'll agree to them. But if he agrees, which of them is a stronger option? So that comes a lot with practice. Then there are questions based on the crux of the passage, that is the key ideas being discussed, or what is also called the main idea of the passage. So for each passage that you study, I would recommend that you need to try and create, for every passage, I would say you should try and create your own summary of the passage. Ideally, you can do that for you can do that for every single paragraph of the passage as well, but you should do it for the entire passage as well. You take the passage and then create an overall summary for the passage. Then you try and think of the points that support, and this should be your practice for all the RCs that you practice. The points that support the author's argument, the points that go against the author's argument. And then you think about what are the points that will continue this passage for. I would do this as a standard practice for all my RCs. In fact, this gives me my next 2 key question types, which is what question types or which of these arguments will strengthen the author's argument, which of these will weaken the author's argument. Both of these mirror images of each other can be used to understand critical reasoning as well. So when I said earlier that we need to practice critical reasoning, one of the key reasons was that all of these common question types, strengthen, weaken, which of these, so you need to also understand what is the difference between an inference, which is something that can be derived from a question, an implication, which is a meaning that I get from the statement, and a conclusion. Again, these are common question types for CAT RCs. So what is the difference between all 3 of them? All of these are covered in critical reasoning, and all of these need to be accordingly, as I say, accordingly practiced to ensure that your RC strength increases. So that is where I was saying that critical reasoning is a very, very important part of your RC prep. What about grammar and vocabulary? Why are they important? So when we go to vocabulary, we need to understand that nobody is going to ask you synonyms or antonyms or idioms and phrases in the CAT test. But if they have been used in the test, then you need to have the understanding of that idiom or that phrase to be able to actually put it in the context of the passage. If you can't do that, then you are in deep trouble, because I have seen a couple of questions where I have not been really able to understand the passage if I didn't get the meaning of a couple of words right. This happened in CAT 20. I will share the passages later. But a lot of the CAT reading comes from very, very esteemed journals, magazines, etc., where the language is very good. So you need to take that into account and then go on to actually understand the passage. So for all the passages that you read now, you should be looking at the kind of words that you don't understand, where you are not able to guess the meaning of the word. Even if you're not able to judge that, try and see how it is placed with respect to the overall passage, how it is connected to the previous and the subsequent statements, and how does it decide the tone of the rest of the passage. That will often give you the context and the possible meaning of the word. Okay, so based on all of this, how does this relate also to para summary and para jumbles? Does it help me in practicing that? Yes. If I have made it a habit to practice para summary for all my RCs, I mean to create a summary, to create a short explanation for all my RCs, you automatically have started creating the practice for your para summary questions as well. Once you start doing that for a largish RC, doing it for a small four-line passage is actually a cakewalk. And there, in fact, you have options to also help you eliminate the, eliminate the wrong answers. So please focus a lot on this so as to ensure that your overall practice and your overall skill level at RCs increases. Coming to the next point, which is para jumbles. How does RC practice help you solve para jumbles? Now, it doesn't necessarily help you solve the para jumble, but once you start reading a passage and once you see how statement 1 is used to build up and create a link with statement 2, how statement 2 is then explained using an example, or the example is used to explain a theory and so on, you are then likelier to understand linkages between statements. Once you see that, then you will be able to also identify that, okay, this kind of a word, for example, words like although, however, nevertheless, are all used to change the tone of the statement. So then, that knowledge helps you identify linkages while solving para jumbles, while solving out of context statements, and so on. So when you are practicing your RCs, don't just practice them as 4 different question types in different silos. You have to look at that entire thing as one comprehensive area of practice that needs to be tackled. Yeah, any questions here, guys? Okay, so from now till say the next 5-6 months till we have CAT, how should your verbal practice go about? So what I would do is, from now on, I would try and ensure that I am practicing at least 4 RCs per week for the next 6 months, or at least for the next 4 months. Which means that if I consider 4 weeks per month and 4 more months now, I am solving anywhere close to 50 RCs simply as practice at a bare minimum. This is apart from the mocks that you solve. The number of mocks that you solve will be completely different. I will be coming to that later. But in terms of your core practice, this is a bare minimum number that I would recommend that you practice over the next 4 months at least. Apart from this, I would say that maybe 1 hour of practice, and here you can focus more on the other 3 question types. I would say 1 hour of practice every alternate day at least for the other 3 question types. And when I look at June and July, I would look at strengthening my basics of grammar, vocab, and critical reasoning as a stepping stone to the other three areas of the VRC section. So I would give at least half an hour every day to these fundamental areas, or maybe let me put it this way, 3 hours per week. When I consider 3 hours per week, it is essentially half an hour per day. If you can't put it daily and you can study grammar once a week for 3 hours, that's fine with me. But ensure that you have given so much time to broadly these three areas, at least for the next 2-3 months, so that your concepts within these areas get strengthened. Then gradually, as you move on to the mocks, you will be able to solve them better once your concepts in CR, RC, etc. have improved. Yeah. So having looked at this, we now move on to the next section, which is DILR, which has a lot of question types involved. And that is something where you especially need to practice to a very large extent. So what is the overall structure of the DILR section? When I go on to DILR, I can divide it into two core parts, as the name suggests, DI and LR. But even before I go into that, I need to understand the structure of the section as I have it in the 2021 paper. I had two sets of 2 questions each, or my bad, 4 questions each. And then I had 2 sets of 6 questions each. So that is how I ended up having 20 questions. Now, as a strategy, I would try and attempt at least 2 to 2.5 sets out of these 4, so as to ensure that my overall percentile is where I want it. So before I go on to attempt strategy and what kind of set to attempt and all of that, let's first understand what you are likely to have here. So within DI, first, you are likely to have your standard graph-based sets, but these are more logical reasoning oriented in nature. Though CAT 2019 was one of the tests where we had calculation-based DI as well. But typically the CAT DI will be such where the graphs will have very simple values. You can basically read them as 4, 5, 10, 40, whatever. But beyond that, you will need to understand what these values represent, how they are related to each other, and then how do I actually create a model around it. So you will have your standard graphs here, which are bar, pie, line, etc. Then you have your unconventional graph. Your unconventional graphs will be graphs that are slightly difficult to read. So here you have graphs like what is called the radar or spider graph. You have a kind of a pie chart, which is called a donut chart. Then you have a graph similar to a line graph, which would be called an XY scatter plot. And then finally, you could have graphs which are called area graphs or area charts. These are all, technically speaking, common charts in MS Excel. You can make them easily, but I would suggest you practice a few of them through MS Excel to understand how these are to be read. The third common question type here within DI is tables. And last, obviously, is caselets. Now, what is exactly a caselet? A caselet is a paragraph comprising all the data that is given in a jumbled manner. And then that jumbled paragraph needs to be sorted to be represented in a structured format. That structured format could be a table, it could be a graph, it could be a figure like a Venn diagram or like a syllogism, and then you try and analyze it for your equations or to create ratios or to create relationships between your variables and solve them. What about tables here? When you look at the tables here, these are not your MHCT or IFT or NMAT style tables where you have a lot of data and your questions will simply be on ratios, averages, etc. No, a lot of your questions in DILR will be based on what is called maxima minima, that is the maximum or minimum values possible for one or more variables. It could depend on the range of values that the variable could take. And obviously, when I consider the range, it could also depend on valid or invalid values that those variables can take. Now, when I look at these kind of question types, obviously one variable can take multiple values, because of which I can create question types which deal with the statements being true in nature or false in nature. So I can have question types which say, which of the following statements are definitely true? And then based on the cases that I have created, you should be able to answer those questions. So generally, when we say which of these statements is definitely true, what do I mean by definitely true? Definitely true means that it needs to be true in all cases. So suppose I say that Gaurav can play cricket on Friday or Saturday. Then the statement that Gaurav plays cricket on Friday is probably true, whereas the statement Gaurav plays cricket on Thursday is definitely false. So these are two completely diametrically opposite situations. But CAT will have questions which are given in this manner. There are a few sets where you will have direct questions, which means that once you fill up the whole grid or once you get all your data into place, then you are liable to answer all the questions directly, which makes your life easier. And that comes under the area of logical reasoning or LR. So what are the key question types here? One, very important from the other exams point of view, for CAT, this is moderate, is arrangements. Typically, you have linear, circular arrangements, matrix arrangements, etc. These, you might not expect very direct questions here, where you won't have questions that end up saying there are 10 people sitting in a straight line, X is third to the left of Y. No, there will be multiple other parameters associated with them. Or even if I have a set like this, it will be conditional in nature. What do I mean when I say that this is conditional in nature? Conditionality implies that there'll be very little data. I might say, okay, there are 5 people who can sit on 20 different seats. The seats have so and so numbers. And then all my questions will have one condition. If person X sits on a prime numbered seat, what can be the sum of seats of persons Y and Z? So you will have to evaluate all the cases which can exist for those particular situations. So that is how CAT will ask you arrangement based questions. The next key, and for me, one of the most important areas for the CAT DILR section is Venn diagrams. Now, this is a conceptual area with a lot of applications because there are 3-4 question types that can be asked here. You can have questions on 3 set Venns. You can have questions on 4 set Venns. You can have questions where the data has to be represented in a tabular manner. In fact, this was one of my question types in CAT 2020, where, for example, I had 2 sets of 2 Venn diagrams that could be formed. So you were better off expressing it as a table. I can have sets where there are 3 different variables with 2 choices each. So 8 combinations in all. So it's better represented as a table. And then you have one of the most difficult question types in Venn diagrams, which is maxima minima based questions, which a lot of students find tough. As of now, I do not need to go into maxima minima, but yes, this require you to understand what will be the most and least number of values that can go into a certain set. So this is a chapter which requires a lot of theory understanding. And that is something you need to start working on upfront. So rather than a mistake that a lot of students make is that they directly jump into Venn diagrams and try to solve the sets. Then when they are unable to solve the sets, they feel demotivated and they start thinking whether they are actually good enough for CAT or not. So that is like saying that I take a car and directly start driving it through a market. That will never work. You first need to understand how the car operates, and then you drive it on an empty road without traffic, and then gradually move on to more crowded situations. Apart from Venn diagrams, what are the 2-3 other areas? One is questions on games and tournaments. Another very common and important question types. When I say games and tournaments, there are 2-3 different types even within this. One, where you have a multiple level tournament, in the sense that you have rules given that, okay, at level 1, so and so thing happens. Then at level 2 or step 2, something else happens, then something else happens, etc. Then you have purely numerical round robin or multiple team tournament. So I say that, okay, there are 10 teams. They are all going to play each other once. Like for example, the IPL. So every team has so many points, and you create a grid marking the number of points and the number of wins and losses for each. Or you can have any other game with any other rule. So you games based on coins, all these kinds of games are possible because these are purely logical in nature. Another question type that could come within this same could be your mental games like Sudoku or Kakuro, all these Japanese games that you have as practice. Once you take all of these into account, then there are all the miscellaneous puzzles which are based on equations, which are based on distribution of values in a group. So for example, I can have, let's say, 50 medals, out of which 20 are gold, 20 are silver, and 10 are bronze. And then those need to be given out to 5 different students. So I can create rules around them, and based on linear equations or inequalities, I would need to allocate them to different people. So distribution, another common question type. And lastly, you have network diagrams and what is called critical path. Now, what are critical path questions? These are process-based questions or figure-based questions. So when I say critical path, you have, let's say, 8 cities. You can travel in multiple ways from one city to the other, or you have 8 different processes where you follow certain rules to go from process 1 to step 2, step 3, and based on that, you have questions asked. Very commonly asked in CAT 19 and 20, not as frequently asked in CAT 21, but one of the favorites as far as CAT is concerned. Now, all of these will have a mix of MCQs and theta questions, but the key feature of all question types with respect to CAT would be that they will be lot more logical in nature rather than mechanical in nature. So how do you prepare for these? So there are certain question types or certain areas where you need theoretical knowledge, and then there are certain question types where you need core practice. So first, let's identify the question types where you need theoretical knowledge. What do I mean by this? You need to have concepts. So your graphs definitely will require you to understand how these are read, how data is represented, how the data needs to be understood, and interpreted from those graphs. So all your standard as well as unconventional graphs need to be understood in terms of reading. For me, most important here is Venn diagrams. As I said, there is a lot of theory involved with respect to 3-set Venns, 4-set Venns, maxima, minima, and it is all based on the mathematical concept of intersection and union of sets. So it is a purely conceptual area which you definitely need to read and understand. Critical path, again, is something that is theoretical in nature. Now, for a lot of you who have done operations management, you would know it is based on, or it is an application of things like PERT, PERT chart, Gantt chart, etc. But at a very fundamental level, it is based on permutations and combinations and what is called the fundamental principle of counting. So definitely these three areas, and then you have what is called game theory. Game theory applies to a lot of those tournament and game-based questions where you need to look at all the stick-based games, your tournament-based games, etc. And in those cases, you need to again have strong fundamentals of permutations and combinations. Last but not the least, your numerical logic or mathematical reasoning questions require you to have strong fundamentals on both equations and inequalities, especially with multiple variables. Why do I say so? There are a lot of questions here where you might have an equation that becomes something like this: a plus b less than 12, and then you have 3a plus 4b less than 15, something of that sort. Now, you might have multiple cases possible. So you need to understand which of my cases are satisfying both these inequalities, and based on those sets that are satisfying these inequalities, how do I create multiple cases? How do I evaluate them? So the knowledge of equations, the knowledge of inequalities comes handy here. So these are all common question types which require some mathematical knowledge or specific theoretical knowledge. In fact, here you will require strong basics of averages, ratios, and percentage groups. All three of them will be required not only for CAT, but even more importantly for all your other MBA entrance exams. On the other side, coming to application-oriented question types, these are question types where you don't require what can be called knowledge that you have earlier. No, that can be solved purely logically. These are a lot of your logical games like Sudoku, etc., or your puzzles. Your arrangement-based questions fall under this category. Your grouping-based questions fall under this category. And your random puzzles again fall in this category. So a lot of the data that you have will fall here. But once you have your basic theoretical knowledge of these logical puzzles, then all of them need to be mastered through practice. Unlike quant, where you need to have a lot of your concepts in place, unlike verbal, where you need to have a strong grammar and vocabulary base, TILR is one area where the key word for your entire strengthening of the section is practice. Now this practice, and in terms of your study plan over the next 6 months, this practice has to be divided into two parts. One obviously is CAT level sets, where like the RCs, I would say that over the next 4 months, you need to solve at least 50 sets in the next 4 months. But what about the other practice? The other practice is more about improving your mental strength. And when I say improving your mental strength, this is where you need to solve a lot of puzzles. These could be pure, simple logical puzzles that you solve as a break. It could be about solving the mathematical games like Sudoku. There are a lot of apps that are available on Play Store where you can actually download puzzles. There are, for examples, there are puzzle types like family tree puzzles, where you have say 10 people who need to be arranged enough and in an entire family. So while that may not be a very common question type for CAT, it is definitely common for the other exams. At the same time, it increases your logical thinking. So this is something that needs to be given at least 15-20 minutes to half an hour every day as a recreationary activity and as practice for CAT. Along with that, I would solve these 50 CAT level sets, maybe once in 2 days, once in 3 days. If you can solve every day, whatever, I am okay. But the same logic that I gave for RC, 4 sets a week, so 16 to 17 sets per month. Over the next 3 months or 4 months, try and reach anywhere close to 50 to 60 sets at the outer side. And that would be my target for you from a practice point of view. When we go to testing, then it's a completely different ball game altogether. But for practice, this is what you need to do. Now, when we talk about practice, what is the point that distinguishes the average student from the good and the great student? The better students, the guys who end up getting the 98, 99 percentiles, typically end up analyzing their sets better. When I say analyzing their sets better, they not only see where they went wrong, but they try and see the given data. So if I have to analyze a DILR set, I would look at my core data and first, based on whatever I solved versus whatever approach has been given in the solution, I would try and see what was the best way of representing the data. Did I actually follow that best particular approach? Did I create a much larger table than was actually required? When I do the video solutions for the mocks, I often say that, hey, look, these 2 questions could have been solved based only on this much data. You didn't need to solve the whole question. So did I miss that point? Was there any data which would have helped me eliminate options in this question? Could I have used a figure instead of a table? Could I have eliminated some of the cases? These are the kind of rhetorical questions you need to keep asking yourself to ensure that you are solving questions better. As they say, work smart, not just work hard. So that is an approach that you need to follow for your CAT preparation all throughout, but especially in DILR. Because please remember, you have only 40 minutes. You have a minimum of 4 sets given to you. Even the standard CAT 99 percentiler is not always able to solve all 4 sets. So you have to be realistic there. Am I able to solve 2 to 2.5 sets? So my first target is 2 sets, around 10 questions. Okay, am I able to do that? Fine. Now can I extend my attempts to a 3rd set? So which is the set I need to attempt first? And the key decision making in DILR becomes this, that out of the 4 sets, which are the 2 sets that I will target and in which order will I attempt them? Because please remember, unlike quant, where you can solve a question in anywhere close to 2 to 3 minutes or 1 to 2 minutes as well, DILR will take a minimum of 10 to 15 minutes per set. And if the set is bad, then you might end up spending 20 minutes. So just imagine a scenario where you spend 20 minutes on a set and then you are unable to solve it. Then you see that right in front of your eyes, your sectional cutoff for DILR has been demolished. And once you know that you will not be able to clear the sectional cutoff for DILR, you automatically switch off during the quant section. You are unable to clear even the sectional cutoff for quant. I have seen this happen to as many students as you can think of. DILR becomes the game changer for all the students. So if I were in your place, I would try and solve as many DILR sets independently as I can, because I would try and increase. The key word for me would be this word familiarity. Very simply, I would try and create my familiarity with different types of data representation, different types of sets. I wouldn't really care right now for timing. There are a lot of students who come to me today and say that, okay, Gaurav sir, I am unable to solve a DILR set in less than 25 minutes. And my first question to them is, are you able to get the structure in place? Are you able to solve all the 4 questions? If the answer to those 2 questions is yes, I am currently not bothered about the timing. Because in CAT, nobody's asking you to solve all 4 sets. The key idea is to solve 2 to 2.5 sets. How and why? Why am I going to that number is something I will tell you once I discuss the quant section. But this is how I would want you to plan and prepare for DILR. Any doubts here before I move on to quant? Guys? Okay, fine. Then let's move on to the last and possibly for a lot of students, the most scoring section, which is quant. As we said, this has anywhere close, this had 22 questions last year. In any structure that we have for CAT, you can expect anywhere close to 22 to 24 questions. Now here this quant can be divided into 4 broad areas. And let's understand the paper structure. This is the only part where I can say that you can predict how many questions you will have per area and what is the approximate weightage of each of those chapters. So what are my 4 broad areas? Based on data from the last 3 to 4 years, the most prevalent and the most important area would be arithmetic. If I say that quant has 22 questions, then arithmetic would be anywhere close to 45 to 50% of the section, which means 9 to 11 questions. So that makes it, and considering the ease of the chapters here, I would say this makes it the most scoring and most important part of the entire section. The next is algebra, and I would combine this with numbers. So when I consider algebra plus numbers, this would be anywhere close to 5 to 6 questions for somewhere around 7 to 8 chapters. The third area that is important is geometry, which is more importantly about polygons like circles, triangles, quadrilaterals, and about mensuration, surface area and volume. This would be anywhere close to 2 to 4 questions. And last, you have modern math. Modern math includes, in my classification, includes area like maxima, minima, APGP, that is sequences and series, then PNC, probability, etc., which would be anywhere close to 1 to 3 questions. So if I take a total of these, let's take an average, 10, 6, 16, 3 to 4, so 20, and then 1 to 2, so 22. So that is the overall breakup. However, there are 2 other ways to also look at the quant section. One is the number of MCQs and the number of theta questions. Typically, what we have seen is that if there are 22 questions in all, then the number of theta questions will be anywhere close to 7 to 9, whereas the rest will be MCQs. So here, if I look at 7 to 9, there will be anywhere close to 60% MCQs, 13 to 50. The third and the most important classification here is by difficulty. As I said earlier as well, this is something which has been, recorded over the last 3 to 5 years over multiple slots. So the data can be said to be consistent. If I look at easy, medium versus difficult, the number of easy questions, including sitters, and believe me, there are some absolute sitters in CAT. So the number of easy questions, including sitters, would be anywhere close to around, say, 10 to 11 questions, which is half the paper. The number of tough questions, the ones that you actually should be leaving, would be 3 to 4 questions. The remaining questions, the remaining 7 to 9 questions, will be those that can be called moderate. When I say moderate, these are the kind of questions that are not evident to all the students, but depending on your strengths, your weaknesses, you can actually either answer them or you might have to leave them. Now, based on this, what are the areas that you need to prepare for within each? First, let's start with the most important one, arithmetic. So this can be divided into 3 parts. One is the ratio-based chapters. Which are these ratio-based chapters? So you have pure ratios, A is to B, B is to C, etc. Then an application of ratios, which would be averages. A further application of both these concepts, which would be mixtures, and what is called alligation. Then you have variation, which is direct inverse proportionality, joint proportion, and an application of joint proportion, which is questions on time and work. Now, within these, averages, mixtures, and time and work are areas where we've seen a lot of questions come in CAT. So I would call this entire section very, very important. The second part within arithmetic would be percentage-based questions. So what are the concepts covered here? You have your core percentages and percentage growth. Then applications of percentage, which are profit and loss. Further applications of percentage, which would be compound interest and simple interest. And then, of course, within that, you can have installments, discounts, EMIs, etc. The last and possibly one of the most important parts of the whole CAT is this. I could call this as an application of both ratios and to a very, very small extent percentages, but predominantly ratios, which is time, speed, and distance. Now, even though this uses a lot of concepts from ratios, why is this treated as a separate chapter? Is because it by itself has anywhere close to 10 to 12 different concepts within it. So here you would be looking at average speed, relative speed, leaps, races. Then you have circular tracks, escalators, and so on. So you have so many different question types which could by themselves be called chapters. And hence this becomes very, very important. So if there are, let's say, 9 to 11 questions here, I would say this by itself would be anywhere between 2 to 3 questions every year. Ratios by itself would be 4 to 6 questions every year. And the percentage based questions would be maybe say 3 to 5 questions every year. This is the core breakup even within arithmetic. The good part about arithmetic is that this is something where the key concepts are not very difficult. So even if you have not studied maths after your class 10, this is something you can understand because all of this is based, solely on 2 concepts, ratios and percentages. Also, in terms of the question types, these tend to be simpler compared to algebra, modern math, and geometry. And that is precisely where you will find most of your sitters coming from this section. And hence, if you make arithmetic into one of your strengths, you have drastically increased your chances of clearing the cutoff for quant. So this for me, so where does it fit in into my prep plan? This for me becomes the core preparation area for June, July, and August. On the other hand, when I look at algebra and numbers, you have what is called number theory, which includes all your types of numbers, primes, real numbers, odd even numbers, their properties. Then you have LCM and HCF along with all their applications. You have divisibility, you have remainders, and then you have algebraic formulae, the standard formulae for squares, cubes, and the related formulae there. Then there are two different, and at one point in time in earlier CAT tests, these used to be very important. Now these have gone down slightly in terms of importance. Now the key areas are logs and surds plus indices. You can expect anywhere close to 2 to 3 questions from here. And the other is equations, which has 3 parts to it. Linear equations in 2 to 3 variables, purely quadratic equations, and you have inequalities, or what could be called inequations, which is a superset of both inequalities and equations. This anywhere would be another 2 to 3 questions. This part I would say would be 1 to 2 questions here. So that is where, when you are preparing for algebra and numbers, if I were a student, I would focus more on logs, surds, and indices right now, rather than numbers and algebraic formulae at this stage. I'm not saying they need to be ignored because they can make a comeback any year, but the number of question types that you have in number theory versus the approximate weightage that we have right now does not justify spending as much time as on logarithms, surds, indices, and equations. So for me, this would be a very, very important focus area as far as algebra is concerned. Coming next to geometry, earlier there used to be questions from multiple areas here, but now the focus is more on polygons, especially 3 broad categories. So you have triangles with 3 sides, you have quadrilaterals, 4 sides, and all kinds of quadrilaterals. And then technically speaking, polygons with infinite sides, that are circles. So these 3 have become the most important areas for geometry, followed by what is called mensuration for 2D figures like the ones mentioned above, and for 3D figures. The 3D figures include cube, cuboid, then you have cylinder, cone, sphere, and hemisphere as the most common ones. Of course, you could have other figures as well, like prism, you could have frustum of a cone, and so on. All of these need to be studied. So the big problem with geometry here is one simple word: too many concepts. I mean, I generally don't like to tell students that, hey, look, there are only 2-3 questions here, so don't study this, don't study that. That's not my approach. But here, when you look at geometry specifically, you realize that for 2 to 3 questions or for 2 to 4 questions, the number of concepts that you need to study is absolutely humongous. So again, in terms of return on investment on your time, this doesn't become as viable today as compared to, say, a month later when you have mastered arithmetic and algebra. Lastly, coming to modern math, 4 broad areas here. One, so I have APGP, that is arithmetic progression, geometric progression, and harmonic progression. Very, very important. So even in isolation, this needs to be studied. Then you have maxima and minima. This has specific concepts where we look at maximizing and minimizing certain functions. This is also related to APGP. This is also related to inequations. So this definitely needs to be studied. Then you have chapters on functions. Once upon a time, functions used to be a very important part of CAT. Now you need to know the core concepts. Here I would say just focus on the basics of functions like into, onto function, range, domain, codomain, etc. Because I have seen even theoretical definitional questions coming from this area. Finally, you move on to PNC and probability. Generally, we see that there are hardly, or I would say no probability questions in the CAT mock, but that's not a rule per se, because nobody can come out and say that the CAT syllabus does not have probability. Simply because there is nothing called a CAT syllabus. Lastly, when we come to PNC, as I explained earlier, PNC, apart from its importance in quant, also has an importance in the DILR section in areas like critical path, games and where there are question types which require knowledge of the basics of permutations and combinations. So these are all the key areas that you need to prepare for when you are looking at the quant section. Now, why did I give you the relative importance here? If I were to be practicing, I would say that the period from June to 15th August is where I would try and master my concepts of arithmetic plus logs, surds and indices, plus equations, plus APGP. That's about it. Even if I am able to achieve this much up to the next 3 months, 21 May to 15 August, I am in a very good space. From 15 August to 15 October, for 2 months, apart from my mocks, what I would try and do is I would go about preparing for geometry, numbers, and strengthen their concepts. In the last 1 month, I wouldn't really want to strengthen my concepts in any of the other chapters because I would be focusing on exam strategy. At that particular stage, I would really be focusing on seeing where I need to improve, either in terms of time or accuracy for these chapters. So when I say strengthen your concepts, what is the process that I would want to follow here? What are the things that I need to do? So for quant, there is a clear-cut flow chart that I would suggest. One, you first focus, and because these are very conceptual areas, you first focus on the concepts, either through a readable lesson. Now this, of course, right now I'm saying this in the context of my study material, but you could have any book, any study material. So you could be reading, say, an Arun Sharma, or you could be reading material from any other institute. That's absolutely fine. But there could be a lesson that covers all the concepts here, or there could be concept videos that you need to watch. But whatever you do for both of these, I generally recommend to students that you create your own notes. What do these notes need to have? These notes need to have important formulae, then various relationships between variables, and what I call limiting conditions. What do I mean by limiting conditions? For example, if I say that one of the most important properties in CAT quant is AM greater than equal to GM greater than equal to HM. But this is defined for positive real numbers. So that is called a limiting condition. Or when I say that logarithms are not defined for negative numbers, then that again is called a limiting condition. Where does a condition like this become important? In log questions, suppose I say, what is the value of X? Let's assume I substitute one of the values of X from the options and my term inside log becomes negative. Then I have to know that logarithm by itself will never be defined here. So that value of x can directly be eliminated. Just imagine knowing this one small property will help you eliminate options in so many question types like logarithms, quadratic equations, functions, APGP, etc. So these notes are what you need to prepare. Apart from your concepts, I would suggest that you need practice at 3 levels here. What are the 3 levels? One is at a pure lesson level, which means that let's say when you are practicing or when you are reading, let's assume mixtures and allegation, then you need to ensure that you are solving anywhere close to 25 to 50 questions at a bare minimum and across different difficulty levels. But at any lesson level, the easiest lesson maybe 30 to 40 questions. For chapters like time and distance, even 100 questions might not suffice. But anywhere close to 25 to 50 questions need to be practiced at that lesson level. Why lesson level? See, what happens with students is, let's assume I am solving time and distance. When I read questions on trains and relative speed, and I solve 5 questions on them, I am able to solve them. But by the time I reach boats, I have forgotten my formula for trains. By the time I reach escalators, I am confused with respect to how boats and escalators are related to each other. So that starts happening, and that is why you need to solve questions which are a combination of these concepts. Master a particular lesson, you need to move to area level practice. Here there is no fixed number. Here my parameter would be, am I able to identify the right concept, the right property or formula, and accordingly create the right approach. What do I mean by this? Across all these, last decade and a half of teaching students for CAT, one of the things that I have seen is students often come and tell me that, sir, when I'm practicing percentages, I'm able to solve the question. But if you give me an arithmetic test, then I'm not really sure whether I need to apply this formula from percentages or from profit and loss or from simple and compound interest. Or when I'm solving a compound interest question, I don't understand how percentage growth came into the picture. So they are not able to interrelate the concepts here and say that, hey, look, this is how these two concepts are linked to each other, so I can solve it using maybe multiple techniques. So that is where your next level of practice has to be at an area level. And finally, you need to move to a section level practice. Why section level? Because CAT will have questions where you have concepts from 2 different or even 3 different chapters which are related to each other. What if I create a question which says, if log of something, and log of something are in a geometric progression or in an arithmetic progression, then what is the value of this function? So there might be 2-3 concepts involved: logarithms, arithmetic progression, and maxima minima. So there, if you say, hey, I have done algebra, I did logs, but I skipped APGP, then what use is logarithms to you, right? So earlier when I said you need to prioritize so many chapters, please understand, I am never saying that you need to skip a certain chapter. You need to prioritize your approach or your focus on those chapters earlier. But in terms of study, you need to master and read all the chapters at least once. Okay. So this is your practice at each level. But how do I practice? When I say practice, how do I practice? What should be your approach while practicing? Do do you really just need to solve, or do you need to analyze? What do you need to do? Anybody with any opinion here? Shweta, what is your opinion on this? How do I analyze a particular question in quant? One of the things that I would do here in quant is just do not solve the question by itself. When you solve a particular question, irrespective of whether you got it right or wrong or left it, you should be trying to figure out how did my approach differ from the approach given, and was there any other way to solve? In fact, what were all the possible ways to solve it? This especially applies in arithmetic and geometry. If you take a question on triangles, maybe if triangles and circles are linked to each other in that question, you will see that you will be able to solve it using inscribed angle theorem or 30-60-90 theorem or some other property or area of triangle. There'll be 4 or 5 different ways in which you could have arrived at your answer. Maybe not completely, but from certain phases of the problem. So are you able to identify all those approaches? For example, do you know that when you want to find area of a triangle, there are at least 5 different formulae or 5 different approaches that you can use? Half into base into height, Heron's formula, half AB sine theta, determinants, similarity, etc. So if I give a question saying what is the area of a triangle, it's not necessary that only one formula will apply. Depending on what data has been given in the from, practicing a question in multiple ways while you are solving. So when you are practicing for quant, my focus would rather be on your quality of solving rather than number of questions. Please understand conceptually this is different from what I mentioned for quant, for DILR and verbal, where I said you need to practice 50 RCs, 60 DILR sets, etc. Here, even if you solve 50 questions per chapter, I'll be happy if you can assure me that you have analyzed each question thoroughly. So this becomes a very, very important point as far as practicing quant is concerned. So even if you have got a question right, please do not rest on your laurels there. This especially happens if one of the options is none of these, or you got the right answer, but maybe you got it with the wrong approach. Lastly, when I come to the test series or the testing part, this section definitely requires a lot of sectional practice and then planning out your attempts for mocks. So for me, this area is something that I would target from June to October. Practice is something that I would start from June right up to the end. And testing, core testing is something that I would start from July up to the end. And having seen this, we will now move to a mock strategy over the next 6 months to see when and how I should be taking mocks. So let's look at these next 6 months and try and see okay, is it advisable to take a or use a calculator if I feel I'll take too long? See, right now, because you have a calculator in CAT, you can and should use it wherever applicable. But at the same time, if you are, if you are able to solve it faster using your own maybe writing skills or maybe using whatever Vedic maths techniques you know, then you can do that. In fact, I would say use both approaches. So for some questions where you feel you are able to solve using shortcuts, do that. Where you feel that it will not work for me, please do not be ashamed to use the calculator, because the calculator is a tool that they have given, assuming you will need it. So diya hi hai, so why not why not utilize it? It doesn't make you a lesser student. Yes, if you are planning to appear for the other exams, then please remember that your reliance on calculator might hamper your prospects there, not necessarily here. Now, if I look at these next 6 months from June to October, then mid-July is typically, or June to November actually, mid-July is typically the period year where the CAT notification is released. And this is the time when we will more or less get an idea as to what is the overall CAT pattern or the duration likely to be. Because please note, the CAT authorities normally never release the number of questions. They will only say that CAT will be a 2-hour test or a 3-hour test. Yes, if there is a change in the structure, they might announce it, and even that is couched in very ambiguous words. They might end up saying that, you know, that the structure within each section will be different or the number of questions might differ from last year. But nowhere is the sectional breakup or the overall breakup ever mentioned. So in that sense, what is the number of mocks that I would take over the next 6 months? What I would do for June is I would target 2 mocks at this stage, keeping a gap of 15 days for feedback and accordingly practice and learning. So let's say I take a mock on the first Sunday of June, say 4th at around 4th or 5th June. Then I analyze that mock, I see where I went wrong, what are the areas I could not attempt, what are the sitters I missed out, etc., etc. Work on that for 15 days. And suppose my first mock was on 5th June, I will take the next one 15 days later around the 20th of June and then repeat the same exercise. In July, I would marginally reduce the frequency because my concept, see, the idea to reduce the frequency is that as you move closer to the exam, your understanding of concepts would have gone up. So the work that you do in those 10 days or those 7 days between mocks would be more about refining your understanding of the concepts rather than actually learning those concepts. So here I would target 3 mocks at a frequency of 10 days. And with the common focus still being feedback, learning, practice. Now, once I come to August and September, for both of these months, I would start targeting 1 mock per week, which means that my frequency of mocks starts becoming weekly. And my approach towards the mocks becomes feedback plus practice plus what can be called attempt strategy. Which means that by this stage, now that I have solved anywhere close to 10 to 12 mocks, I need to start thinking about how I am going to attempt those mocks. So when we come to August, we will do similar sessions where we will actually analyze how a mock needs to be approached. Then when I move to October, this would be the key month for me to practice the mocks, where I would possibly be practicing mocks every 4 to 5 days, which means that I would be looking at anywhere close to 6 to 7 mocks in this entire month, which makes it a frequency of 4 to 5 days here. And obviously, when I have mocks every 4 to 5 days, my focus can no longer be practice here. My focus is now what can be called targeted feedback, which means I'm looking at very, very specific sectional improvements, and I am looking at mastering my attempt strategy. Coming to the last month, which is the last 20-25 days of November, I would here be solving mocks every 3 to 4 days, which means that I would be solving anywhere close to another 6 to 8 mocks here, and with a frequency of 3 to 4 days, with an overall focus on scores. So the mistake that a lot of students do is that they try and focus on the scores here. And they come to me and say, okay, Gaurav, out of 198, which is the current structure, I am getting a score of only 50 or 60. And I'm not really bothered at this stage because that score is okay for me. But yes, in November, if you come and tell me 60, then that's a problem. Right now, I would be more focused on you identifying your strengths and weaknesses. So if I go with this kind of a mock structure, the total number of mocks that I would be attempting would be anywhere around 13 plus 15 or 13 plus 12, which means 25 to 30 mocks would be my overall attempt pattern. Now here, a common question that students ask me is, should I go for one test series? Should I go for multiple test series? I generally suggest that 2 test series is generally a good number for you to practice. Now, does that mean that you need to have 25 tests of one test series and 25 from somebody else? No. You can take anywhere close to 10 to 12 tests from one institute and 10 to 12 tests from the other institute. Why is that important? Because generally, when you take tests from any one institute, the pattern of the questions, the styling of the options, etc., starts following a very subtle pattern over a period of time. So you are dealing only with one kind of a test, and that is why you start falling into a comfort zone. When you start mixing at least 2 to 3 test series, then you are dealing with different test creation philosophies over a very short window of time. And because of that, you learn to adapt faster. So for me, this is always a better approach compared to taking only one test series. So this would be my overall idea for mocks. In terms of sectionals, area level practice, lesson level practice, etc., what I generally tell students is that there, what you need to do for your study plan is to identify the number of hours that you can do. See, how I would calculate this is that from, let's say, 25th May to 25th November, you have nearly 180 days left with you, which is approximately 6 months. So what you need to do is identify. So this is your first step. You identify the number of hours that you can put per day on an average. I am not saying that you create a daily scheduler from now till November. That never works. But on an average, let's say if you are able to say that, okay, I am able to put in, say, 2 hours of study every weekday and 5 hours of study every weekend, then the way I would calculate it is that in these 6 months, I have 25 weeks. So I am essentially, for all these 25 weeks, if I'm putting 5 hours over one weekend, that is over a Saturday, and 5 hours on a Sunday, then I have 10 hours here, and 2 hours into 10 or 2 hours into 5 days, another 10 hours. So can I give 20 hours per week? So if I multiply this 25 weeks with 20 hours each, then I am left with 500 hours of study. So what might feel like 6 months, a lot of students say, mere paas 6 mahina hai, but you don't necessarily have the whole of 6 months. You have only 500 hours. Now you break this up based on your strengths and weaknesses or your preparation into how much will I need to study, how much will I need to practice, what is the time I will need to test myself, and what is the time I will need for analysis. And then break this up and try and create your weekly schedule. So for instance, if I say that, okay, across all sections, there are close to 80 chapters, then to read a chapter, understand a concept, maybe practice a few questions. If you are assuming anywhere close to 2 to 3 hours for 80 chapters, then you have lost 200 hours straight away, or you have utilized 200 hours straight away. Then if you say that over the next 6 months, if I'm going to solve 25 mocks, which are 2-hour mocks, then you have put in another, or 30 mocks. So you have put in another 50 hours here. For each mock, typically you will need 2 to 3 hours of analysis. So for 50 mocks, if you, or for 25 mocks, you might need another 50 hours for analysis. How much does that leave you with? Hardly 200 hours for practice. So just think about it, which means again, you have hardly 2-3 hours to practice 80 chapters. Do you have enough time? Maybe not. So then you need to ask yourself, boss, is 500 hours enough for me? Can I somewhere extend my study time to take it up to 800 hours? Can I extend it to 1000 hours? Do I have that much time? Or do I need to change my breakup of testing, practice, and theory? I will share an Excel sheet with all of you where you can make your own study plan over the next 6 months. You can create a weekly schedule. Give me time till around Wednesday or Thursday, and I will be sharing it with all of you who had registered for this session. Some of you may not have been able to join, or some of you dropped off earlier, but no worries. I will share this, and you will be able to connect with me as well to understand how to make the study plan. But this is how you will yourself need to create a plan over the next 6 months. Lastly, coming to the concluding part of this session, something that I will repeat in all the sessions that I do for CAT is what should be the marks that you should be targeting. Now, right now I'm not going to go at a sectional level predominantly. I will start with an overall level. Generally, everybody says, okay, I want to target 99 percentile. Then let's say we have 98, 95, and 90. If I look at the overall marks, then I know that total marks are 198. So based on historical data, what we need to understand is that the overall score for a 99 percentile typically, historically, has been somewhere around 55%. Now, when I consider a 55% score for a 99 percentile, whereas the overall percentage score for a 90 percentile has been anywhere close to a 33 to 35%, or even a 30%. So 95 percentile is somewhere around 40%, and a 98 percentile is somewhere around a 50% score. Right now, I'm not going into a 100 percentile because maybe, out of 2 lakh students, there'll be hardly a handful who are 100 percentiles. So right now, we don't go into that. Now, if I compare these scores, what would be 55% of 198? This score would be somewhere around 109 or 110. What would be 50%? It would be 99 to 100. What would be 40%? It would be around 80. And 1/3 of this would be somewhere around 65 to 70. So when you are planning your strategy, you are planning your attempts, you would then need to work out your sectional strategy based on these percentages. What do I mean by this? If I proportionately take these same scores for each section, then VA is 24 questions into 3 marks, so 72. DILR is 20 into 3, that's 60. And Quant is 66. Now take these percentages here. For DILR, 1/3, so 20 marks here. 40% would be 24, 30, and 55% would be somewhere around 33. These are all estimates. What about VA? 1/3 of 20 of 72, so around 25. 40% would be around 30. Then 50% is around 35 to 36. And 55% would be somewhere around 40 or 39 to 40. Lastly, coming to quant, this number correspondingly would be 22, and you take the totals, you'll get 67 here. When you take 40% of this is around 26, you'll get 80 here. You take 50%, which is around 33. Again, this value comes out to be around 98. And then 55% of 66 would be basically around 38 or so. So these are the target values that I have for each section. But let's say I want to achieve a benchmark figure of say 95% right now. So I want to cross this value, suppose. Then how should I plan my attempts? I am not saying that you aim for this value right now, but if you want to say that, okay, I want to feel confident that I can get a 95%, how would I do that? Understand this. Let's start with quant. I want a score of around 26. Create a linear equation here. Every correct question gives me 3 marks. Assuming all MCQs, every incorrect question takes away 1 mark. So I have 3a minus b equal to 26. Then at a bare minimum, I know that if my a is equal to 10 and my b is equal to 3, then I end up with 30 minus 3, 27 marks. Or if my a is 10 and my b is 2, I end up with 30 minus, if this is 9 and 2, I end up with 27 minus 2, that is 25 marks. So what I am seeing here is that anywhere close to 11 to 12 attempts or 11 to 13 attempts with a 90% accuracy will start giving me the 95 odd percentile. So this is what I would aim for at this stage. Am I able to attempt half the paper? Now what happens is a lot of students try and aim for the sun, moon and stars right up front. Let me try and attempt 20 questions out of 22. Who told you to do that? You don't need to. Attempt half paper, 60% of the paper, it's enough. What about DILR? You want 24? You can get that as 3 into 9 minus 2 once again will give you a score of 25. Why did I take this value 9 here and 2 here? Because if I attempt one set of 4 questions, one set of 6 questions, and I get most of them right, I have ended up getting 10 attempts. And at 10 attempts with 1 or 2 questions wrong, I have ensured that I get a score somewhere around 24 or 25. So you remember when I said that our initial target in DILR has to be to attempt only 2 sets. This is what I was referring to. That even if you can get 2 sets and attempt them perfectly, you have assured yourself that you are very close to a 95 percentile. Then if you have attempted even a couple of questions from the 3rd set, you have started moving towards your 97, 98 percentile, which is enough to clear the sectional cutoff of most institutes. The same logic applies here. Out of the 24 questions, you want 30. So if I have a score of, because here in verbal, the accuracy of people tends to be lower, I would say that you need at least 12 correct attempts and 4 to 5 incorrect attempts to get a score of 30. Which means that here I would be looking anywhere at 17 to 18 attempts. And where will I get 17 to 18 attempts from? If I want 17 attempts, I will need to attempt 3 RCs out of 4. I will need to attempt 5 VA questions out of 8. That is how I will end up with 17 to 18 attempts. So then when you are planning your attempts in the mock, this is how you can plan your paper. But this slide or this part of the discussion should come under your thought process much later, when when you feel that, hey, look, now now I am mastering all my concepts, I have practiced enough questions, and then I want to attempt more questions here. At that stage, you can work on specific attempt strategy. Right now, your whole goal has to be identification of your strengths and trying to be able to solve most questions without a timer. If you can satisfy these two goals, you are on the right track. So for now, I would say this is my overall thought process of how a 6-month plan can be created. Shweta, Kaushik, what I will be doing is I will be sharing a study plan creator Excel sheet, and I will be sharing a list of chapters with their relative importance by the middle of next week. This will go out to all the registered students who had registered for this session. You can go through that, and then please feel free to reach out to me as and when you have any doubts with respect to your CAT preparation. So any questions, both of you? Yeah. Okay, then thank you so much. I'll call it a day here, and we can always connect separately as and when you all have any doubts. Thank you and wish you all the best.